Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are reviewing Echo, the new Disney Plus MCU show, with all 5 episodes now streaming. This is going to be a spoiler review, so switch off, this is your warning. And it is the first MCU show to be branded around this darker, more mature content rating under their Spotlight banner. Now, in my opinion, this show had 2 really big attractions, and they were Vincent D'Onofrio returning as Kingpin in a bigger capacity, and this new, mature, R-rated content-like tone that it was going to be going for. And I will give you 2 guesses what the 2 most disappointing aspects of this show are. I just want to talk about the life of the series in the first place, because I feel like most people weren't really excited for Echo. Me being one of them. It's not that I wasn't open to the idea, it's just that I was indifferent. This isn't a character that I particularly cared about, and following Hawkeye, that did nothing to remedy that either. And I think based around how this show was marketed, which was basically spoiling Charlie Cox's Daredevil cameo, and heavily marketing it around Vincent D'Onofrio returning as Kingpin and canonizing the Netflix series, it suggested an awareness to the lack of interest in the project to begin with, but the promotional aspects around this show seem to be leaning in towards this mature, grittier tone and the return of Kingpin. Neither of those 2 things, in my opinion, succeed at delivering on what we were sold this project as. This mature approach, this bloodier, grittier tone, really doesn't leave much impact. There are a few more blood spatters that come out of punches and gunshots, and a few more bloody fists in the game, but that is really all there is to elevate this show into a darker place. I think overall, while there may be less MCU cringe comedy, there is still a levity. The show still looks very light and feels very light and vibrant and colourful. So tonally, I feel missold on what this project was going to be. I would say it's darker than most MCU shows and films, that's not hard. But dark to the point of giving this show its own content warning and marketing the whole project around it, definitely not. The other big thing was Wilson Fisk's return, and seeing his backstory with Maya and his present story continue with Maya and that relationship unfold. I don't know, I feel like I was expecting more from that. I think both of Wilson Fisk's returns now on the small screen have felt very small and very inconsequential. Obviously this was a much more personal story rather than a look into his empire and his place within the wider world. But both in Hawkeye and Echo, he's presented as the big boss, the main antagonist. And I feel like we have yet to see, especially for new viewers unfamiliar with the Netflix Daredevil show, anything worth validating and solidifying Wilson Fisk's position as a main antagonist. And for returning viewers like myself who are such fans of Vincent D'Onofrio and this portrayal of Kingpin, it's hard to find satisfaction in the portrayals that we're getting at the moment. Don't get me wrong, Vincent D'Onofrio is just a presence. His gravitas, his physique, his baritone voice, and the emotional weight that he can lend, particularly in his scenes with Maya, are all there. I just think the script fails to service him in a meaningful way. His relationship with Maya is arguably the key to the whole show and the dramatic tensions that come from it. And based on the flashbacks that we get between Fisk and Maya, that would have made for a much better show. This idea of Kingpin grooming Maya into being his protege and manipulating her to embrace that darkness herself, rather than following the fallout of a relationship that we've never seen established in the first place or unfold. And also, in a 5-episode series where most episodes are 35 minutes, there is not really any screen time to service any of the characters in a particularly captivating way. This show was at best just fine. The most interesting aspects of it, as unsatisfying as they were the scenes between Kingpin and Maya, and also the glimpses and exposure of the Choctaw Nation and their culture and their backstory, and the way that eventually infused into Maya's journey was pretty well done. But as I've already said, this kind of build up to that and the way that that gets expanded over 5 very short episodes doesn't feel like it does enough to lend significance to the finale. I feel like the finales of all the MCU shows at the moment have been very short and very underwhelming, and Echo is no different in that regard. The payoff of the journey and the concept is there, but the emotional fulfillment of that journey is not. It's nowhere to be seen. The fight scenes, which I was also really looking forward to, are so sparse. There's so few action scenes in this show worth commenting on. The main one is in episode 1, which really doesn't help. But it shows a lot of ambition and a lot of promise with their action direction. I wouldn't say it lives up to the one takes in Daredevil or the scrappiness and the grittiness that came with that. Echo feels much more stagey and choreographed in that regard, but it does at least demonstrate a lot of effort went into choreographing and thinking about the staging and the orchestration of some of those action sequences. It's just a pity we didn't get more, because I think the only two of note are the first episode, and in episode 3 there's a bit of a brawl in a roller skate rink. And for a show so heavily marketed around the brutality, again, that was very underwhelming to see. It wouldn't be a problem if what we got instead was incredibly compelling, engaging content, but it wasn't. Episode 1 feels like a very sped up exposition dump, catching new viewers up to the present day and basically recapping her Hawkeye appearances. And I definitely think the ensemble needed so much more screen time, so much more development. Echo's relationships with all the people in this hometown when she returns are so threadbare, and all we really have to go on is the relationship she had in the past with them, because none of the present scenes really do enough to commit you to that. She has a relationship with a childhood friend, Bonnie, who she became estranged from. Their reunion falls flat. The one scene that I thought landed really well was a scene with her and her estranged grandmother, and when they reunite and talk about these spiritual occurrences and her ancestry. And the acting from both there was really convincing, and was one of the few times in the show that I felt sold on the trauma and the history of this relationship. It has some fun with that ancestral cultural element to it. The first 3 episodes all have a prologue sequence that alludes to this Choctaw ancestry and spirituality, but we definitely needed more of that for it to land with emotional weight. It feels like we come to this new setting, and this new Western country feel really works for the MCU. I really liked the setting and the environment that we were in, but it feels as though you're expected to connect with the ancestry and the spirituality just because you're told to. The show really doesn't have much interest in fleshing out this ensemble, their history, or their customs, despite the fact that I think they want you to feel that way. These people in the story really aren't given the exposure as characters, as opposed to just being plot points for Maya to reconnect with. This town and this setting never really comes alive, and that became glaringly obvious in episode 5, when there's this big parade and fair celebrating that heritage and that culture, and it suddenly feels like a very last-ditched attempt to solidify Maya's connection with that past and that culture. And let's also talk now about how Kingpin in both Hawkeye and Echo has been defeated in very underwhelming ways. We're not going to talk about that Hawkeye finale because that just grinds my gears. And in Echo, it's a similar thing. My issue isn't that he was beaten, it's the way in which they stage and handle the scene. He's in this barn, he's holding Maya's friends and family hostage. Maya channels the connection and the power of her ancestors in order to overpower these henchmen. And that also empowers her friends and family to fight back as well. And the entire time that's happening, we don't cut to Kingpin. And when we do cut back to Kingpin, he has just stood there. He has just stood there while these 3 people are overpowering his bodyguard. And the way that his physical move is choreographed before he gets defeated just comes across as so comically embarrassing that I don't know how people watched that back, choreographed that and said, yes, that's the move. Despite the old glimpse and glimmer of that complex, empathetic character that we knew and loved from the Daredevil show, gone are the days where we treat him with that kind of maturity. And in the moments when the show does treat him like that, it's very shortly snatched away afterwards. I think Echo as a character as well is not given much in the script to service her motivations, to service her emotions and her development. The journey she goes on doesn't feel particularly captivating. And again, it's because you're being asked to invest in a story that you've not seen play out. And so then that relies on the scenes in the present to do a lot of the heavy lifting to carry that history with it. And those scenes don't manage to do that despite the best efforts from a pretty capable cast. Alaqua Cox is great as Maya. She's very convincing both physically and emotionally as this stoic individual, but the script needed to do more to round her off as a character and give her those extra dimensions that really kept you hooked with her journey and her progress. I also think the show missed such an opportunity with this death element. Why was there not an entire episode that was just silence, no muffled sound, no soundtrack, just dead silence, so that you could really live in that mode with Maya, so you could really lack that surround sound and spatial awareness and only being able to clock what's in front of you visually, and have attackers come out of the blue behind you that you're unprepared for, and show that miscommunication when she can't communicate with people who don't know ASL. And while they do drip feed that in and out of the show, I don't think the show leans enough into what makes it unique in order for it to stand out. I think the way the show could have played with sound and the use of hearing, the way that the show could have lent so much more into the Native American history and culture, to flesh out the community of this town that we're in that feels ultimately populated by about 6 individuals. The level of brutality and darkness that this show could have committed to to really launch pad this new mature content brand of Marvel. But ultimately it all boils down to writing, because if the writing isn't good enough, then the story isn't compelling enough, and you as the viewer are left dissatisfied, which is ultimately what I feel. I liken it to Miss Marvel because it was a similar thing, introducing a new hero, introducing a new kind of cultural element and spiritual element to the MCU, being just fine enough for you to plod on to the end, but ultimately never giving it a second thought after you've watched it. Despite some standout scenes and some stellar performances and the occasional glimmer of greatness in their action sequences, the show does not do enough to set it apart, unfortunately. So if you have seen it, guys, please drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Please also consider liking and subscribing to the channel. That's also a huge help for me. And in the meantime, we'll see you for the next review.